March 7, 1945. Remagen, Germany. 1550 hours. The Rhine River moved slowly beneath the Ludendorff Bridge, its gray-green waters reflecting the late afternoon light that broke through gaps in the cloud cover. Oberleutnant Karl Scheller stood at the eastern approach to the bridge, one hand gripping the cold steel railing, the other holding a pair of binoculars trained on the far bank. The air smelled of diesel exhaust and cordite, the distant rumble of artillery a constant backdrop that had become so familiar he barely registered it anymore. His orders were clear: hold the bridge until demolition charges could be properly set, then destroy it before American forces could cross. The Rhine was Germany's last natural barrier, the final defensive line between Allied armies and the industrial heartland of the Ruhr. At 1550, he saw them. American vehicles appeared on the western approach road, not a reconnaissance probe or an advance patrol, but a full column. Tanks, half-tracks, trucks, all moving with purposeful speed toward the bridge. Behind him, German engineers worked frantically with the demolition charges, tangled wires and faulty connections delaying the destruction. Scheller watched the Americans advance, expecting them to pause, to probe for weaknesses, to coordinate an assault that would take hours to develop. They didn't pause. The lead Sherman tank accelerated onto the bridge deck, its treads clanging against steel and concrete. Infantry followed immediately, running across the span while German machine guns opened fire. The Americans didn't stop to return fire systematically, they simply advanced through it, some men falling, others continuing forward. More vehicles poured onto the bridge. The first Sherman reached the eastern bank, its gun traversing to engage German positions. Within minutes, a second tank crossed, then a third. Scheller grabbed the detonation handle and pulled. Nothing happened. He pulled again. A single explosion erupted near the bridge's center, insufficient to collapse the structure. American infantry were already streaming onto the eastern bank, establishing positions, suppressing German defenders with coordinated fire. The bridge, which should have fallen into the Rhine, stood intact. And across it, American forces continued to flow, not in cautious increments but in a steady, unstoppable stream. He watched in disbelief as more units arrived on the western bank, as traffic control personnel appeared to direct vehicles, as engineers ran onto the bridge to examine its structure, all while combat continued around them. There was no confusion, no hesitation, no apparent pause to consolidate. The Americans simply crossed and continued advancing, each unit knowing its role, each soldier understanding where to go and what to do. Within an hour, hundreds of American soldiers had established a bridgehead on the eastern bank of the Rhine, and the vehicles continued to cross. Scheller fell back with his surviving men, watching American forces expand the bridgehead with mechanical efficiency. They didn't celebrate their success. They didn't pause to marvel at capturing the bridge intact. They just worked, digging positions, emplacing weapons, clearing routes, all with the practiced coordination of men executing a plan everyone understood. The speed was incomprehensible, the organization overwhelming. This was not the chaotic American Army German propaganda had described. This was something else entirely, a military force operating with coordination so perfect it appeared automatic, a machine composed of men but functioning with systematic precision that left no room for German counteraction. As darkness fell, Scheller heard the sound that would haunt him for what remained of the war, the continuous rumble of vehicles crossing the Ludendorff Bridge, a mechanical river flowing east to join the waters of the Rhine, unstoppable and endless. The capture of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen on March 7, 1945, was not supposed to happen. German doctrine called for systematic destruction of all Rhine bridges before Allied forces could reach them, a strategy that had been executed successfully at every other crossing from Switzerland to the North Sea. The Rhine represented the last major geographical obstacle protecting Germany's industrial core, and Hitler had ordered its defense with characteristic ruthlessness. Commanders who failed to destroy bridges before Allied capture faced execution. The bridges were wired with demolition charges, guarded by dedicated demolition units, and scheduled for destruction at the first sign of Allied approach. But at Remagen, a confluence of mechanical failure, command confusion, and American speed created an opportunity. The demolition charges failed to detonate completely. German reinforcements were delayed. And the American forces who arrived at the bridge, elements of the 9th Armored Division, made a decision that exemplified the operational flexibility and aggressive initiative that characterized American military operations by 1945. They attacked immediately, without waiting for orders, without conducting elaborate reconnaissance. trusting that their training and their systems would enable them to exploit the opportunity. The decision was made by Lieutenant Karl Timmerman, commanding officer of Company A, 27th Armored Infantry Battalion, who saw the bridge still standing and ordered his men across without consulting higher headquarters. His initiative was supported immediately by his battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Engemann, who committed additional forces. Within hours, the division commander, Brigadier General William Hogue, had shifted his entire command to exploit the bridgehead. Within 24 hours, 3 divisions were crossing at Remagen. Within a week, the bridgehead contained over 25,000 men and thousands of vehicles. The speed of American response, from individual lieutenant making a tactical decision to theater command committing strategic reserves, demonstrated coordination operating at every level simultaneously. There was no prolonged decision-making process, no bureaucratic delay, no waiting for permission to exploit success. The system was designed to reward initiative, to escalate success rapidly, to shift resources toward breakthrough points automatically. When opportunity appeared, American forces at every echelon understood their role in exploiting it. For German defenders, the experience was profoundly disorienting. They had been trained to expect methodical Allied operations, careful reconnaissance followed by deliberate attacks, pauses to consolidate after success, predictable rhythms that allowed defensive planning. Instead, they faced an opponent who moved faster than their command structure could react, who coordinated operations across multiple echelons simultaneously, who seemed to anticipate requirements before circumstances created them. The Americans appeared to operate without friction, without the delays and confusion that German forces knew were inevitable in warfare. The reality was more complex. American operations were not frictionless. They encountered problems, faced delays, made mistakes. But the systems underlying American military operations by 1945 had evolved to minimize friction, to enable coordination across vast distances and complex organizations, to function effectively despite the chaos and confusion inherent in combat. The apparent ease with which American forces operated was not natural talent or lucky improvisation. It was the result of systematic development of doctrine, training, communications, and logistics that enabled coordination at scales unprecedented in military history. German forces, observing this coordination, struggled to comprehend how it functioned. Their own military tradition emphasized individual excellence, tactical finesse, operational artistry by skilled commanders. The American approach seemed to minimize individual brilliance in favor of systematic competence, to prefer reliable mediocrity over unpredictable genius, to trust processes more than personalities. To German officers trained in the tradition of Auftragstaktik, mission-type orders that granted subordinates wide latitude, the American system appeared both more rigid and more flexible simultaneously, bound by procedures yet capable of rapid adaptation. The contradiction was only apparent. American coordination was built on standardization that enabled flexibility, on systematic training that made improvisation possible, on reliable communications that allowed decentralized execution of centralized plans. It was coordination achieved through common understanding rather than detailed orders, through systems that functioned predictably rather than brilliantly, through an organizational culture that valued initiative within established frameworks. The foundation of American coordination was doctrine, standardized approaches to military operations codified in field manuals, training programs, and organizational structures. Unlike German doctrine, which emphasized principles to be interpreted by skilled commanders, American doctrine prescribed specific procedures to be followed by competent officers. The U.S. Army's field manuals covered every aspect of operations, from how to call artillery fire to how to organize traffic control during river crossings. The manuals were detailed, prescriptive, and universally applied. This standardization meant that American units from different divisions, even different theaters, could work together with minimal coordination. An artillery battalion from California could provide fire support to an infantry regiment from New York without extensive liaison because both followed the same procedures for fire missions. An engineer company from Texas could construct bridges according to specifications understood by any American unit that would use them. The standardization eliminated the need for extensive coordination by making most coordination unnecessary. Everyone already knew what everyone else would do. The field manuals were not inflexible scripts but frameworks within which initiative operated. They specified what should be done and how, but left considerable room for when and where to local commanders. An infantry company commander knew exactly how to conduct an attack, the sequence of actions, the communication protocols, the support coordination, but decided whether to attack, from which direction, with which emphasis based on his assessment of the situation. The doctrine provided the vocabulary and grammar. Commanders composed the sentences. This approach was fundamentally different from German military practice. German doctrine emphasized Auftragstaktik. Commanders received mission objectives and were expected to determine methods independently, using their professional judgment and tactical skill. The system worked brilliantly when commanders were talented and experienced, producing operational flexibility and tactical innovation. But it required exceptional officers at every level and created coordination challenges when multiple units needed to cooperate in complex operations. American doctrine assumed commanders would be competent rather than exceptional, and built systems that functioned reliably with competent execution. The emphasis was on collective effectiveness rather than individual brilliance, on ensuring that average units performed well rather than enabling exceptional units to perform brilliantly. The result was an army that was less dependent on individual genius but more consistently effective across its entire force structure. The Germans recognized this difference but struggled to counter it. A captured German intelligence assessment from February 1945, translated by American interrogators, analyzed American command practices. The enemy's coordination relies not on superior command talent but on superior systems. Their commanders at every level follow standardized procedures that enable cooperation without detailed orders. Their communications networks function reliably, allowing rapid dissemination of information and orders. Their logistics deliver supplies predictably, allowing operations to be planned with confidence. The cumulative effect is an army that operates with coordination exceeding what their individual commanders' abilities would suggest. They have systematized what we rely on intuition to achieve. The assessment was perceptive but came too late to matter. By 1945, American forces had refined their coordination systems through 3 years of combat, had built organizational cultures that valued systematic execution over individual heroics, had developed the communications and logistics infrastructure that made coordination possible at operational and strategic scales. The German army, by contrast, was disintegrating, its command structures fragmented, its communications unreliable, its logistics collapsed, its coordination reduced to whatever individual commanders could improvise with dwindling resources. Central to American coordination was communications infrastructure that enabled rapid information flow and responsive command. By 1945, American divisions possessed radio equipment that would have been considered excessive luxury by any other army. Radios at battalion, company, and often platoon level, with standardized frequencies and communication procedures that allowed units to coordinate easily. The Signal Corps, often overlooked in accounts emphasizing combat arms, provided the nervous system that made the American military organism function. The SCR-300 walkie-talkie radio, issued to infantry company commanders and platoon leaders, exemplified the American approach. The radio weighed 35 pounds, had an effective range of 3 miles, and provided reliable voice communication in most terrain. It was not sophisticated technology, the design was simple, the components were standard, but it was manufactured by the hundreds of thousands and issued ubiquitously. American infantry commanders took for granted the ability to communicate with subordinates and superiors instantly, to coordinate actions in real time, to call for support without relaying messages through runners or signal flags. German infantry, by contrast, relied primarily on wire communications that were vulnerable to artillery fire and required physical connection between command posts. German platoon and company commanders often lacked radios entirely, depending on runners or wire teams to maintain communications. The result was that German coordination required more time, was more fragile. Disruption, and was more dependent on pre-planned actions rather than responsive adaptation. The communications advantage multiplied across echelons. American battalion commanders could communicate directly with company commanders and with regimental headquarters simultaneously. Regimental commanders coordinated with battalions, with supporting artillery, with attached tank units, with air support liaison officers, all through reliable radio networks. Division commanders monitored multiple radio nets simultaneously, maintaining awareness of operations across their entire area of responsibility. The communications infrastructure created what modern doctrine would call situational awareness. Commanders at every level understood what was happening beyond their immediate observation, could make decisions informed by comprehensive information, could coordinate actions across time and space. This communications capability enabled the rapid exploitation at Remagen. When Lieutenant Timmerman decided to cross the bridge, he reported his action immediately to his battalion commander via radio. Battalion reported to regiment, regiment to division, division to corps, corps to army, army to theater headquarters. Within hours, General Dwight Eisenhower, commanding all Allied forces in Europe, knew that an intact bridge had been captured and was making strategic decisions about how to exploit it. The information flowed rapidly not because of exceptional efficiency, but because the communication systems were designed to facilitate such information flow routinely. The subsequent commitment of forces to expand the Remagen bridgehead demonstrated coordination enabled by reliable communications. Units were redirected from other sectors, support assets were shifted, logistics routes were reorganized, all coordinated through radio communications that allowed simultaneous rather than sequential coordination. Multiple commanders at different echelons made complementary decisions simultaneously because all had access to common information through shared communications networks. German defenders attempting to contain the Remagen bridgehead faced coordination challenges that American communications infrastructure had eliminated. German units were ordered to counterattack but arrived piecemeal because coordination delays prevented simultaneous assembly. German artillery attempts to destroy the bridge were hampered by communication failures between observation posts and firing batteries. German air attacks, launched desperately despite overwhelming Allied air superiority, achieved minimal coordination because command communications were fragmented and unreliable. General-Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, commanding the LIII Corps tasked with containing Remagen, described his frustration in post-war interrogation. "We received orders from multiple headquarters, often contradictory, always delayed. We attempted to coordinate counterattacks but lacked reliable communications between units. Radio messages were intercepted or jammed. Wire communications were severed by American artillery. Runners took hours to deliver messages that circumstances had made obsolete. Meanwhile, the Americans coordinated their operations instantly, shifted forces rapidly, concentrated support where needed. They fought with perfect information while we fought nearly blind." This was not a battle between armies, but between a coordinated system and isolated fragments. The symbol of American coordination at Remagen and throughout the European campaign was neither a weapon nor a vehicle but a sound, the constant hum of radio traffic, the background noise of coordination occurring continuously across every level of American forces. In command posts from platoon to theater headquarters, radios operated constantly, transmitting situation reports, orders, requests for support, coordination between adjacent units. The sound was so pervasive that soldiers became unconscious of it, but its absence would have paralyzed operations immediately. 4 German soldiers captured during the fighting at Remagen. The experience of American command posts was revelatory. They observed radio operators managing multiple networks simultaneously, officers monitoring several conversations while making decisions, information flowing continuously without apparent effort. The contrast with their own experience of isolation, of delayed information, of orders arriving hours after circumstances had changed, made clear the systematic advantages American forces possessed. One captured German officer, a major commanding a Panzer Grenadier battalion committed to the Remagen counterattack, provided detailed observations during his interrogation in late March 1945. "In our command post, we had one radio, often non-functional due to battery failures or atmospheric interference. We sent runners to coordinate with adjacent units, taking 30 minutes or more for messages to arrive. We received orders from division by motorcycle courier, sometimes arriving 3 or 4 hours after being issued. We operated largely on initiative, guessing what higher headquarters intended because we could not communicate with them reliably. In the American command post where I was taken after capture, I counted 6 radios operating simultaneously. Officers spoke casually into handsets, issuing orders, receiving reports, coordinating with units I could not even see on the maps. They knew the positions of all their subordinate units, knew what support assets were available, knew what adjacent American units were doing. They operated with information abundance while we operated with information scarcity. This abundance enabled their coordination. They could plan with confidence that orders would be received, that support would arrive when requested, that units would coordinate because everyone shared common understanding of the situation. The observations were accurate. American command posts at every level operated with information density that German forces could not match. The constant flow of reports and orders created shared situational awareness that enabled coordination without detailed instructions. Subordinate commanders understood the overall situation and could make decisions that complemented rather than contradicted others' actions. The system functioned not through brilliant command, but through reliable information flow that made competent command sufficient. This information-centric approach extended to the coordination between different arms: infantry, armor, artillery, engineers, air support. American doctrine emphasized combined arms operations where different unit types supported each other systematically. The coordination was enabled by standardized procedures and reliable communications. An infantry battalion commander could request artillery fire by radio, providing target coordinates and receiving fire missions within minutes. The same commander could coordinate with attached tank platoons, with engineer support, with air liaison officers calling close air support, all through radio networks that connected different branches seamlessly. German forces, attempting to coordinate similar combined arms operations, faced systematic disadvantages. Their artillery support, though often technically excellent, was slower to respond because communications between infantry and artillery were less reliable. Their coordination between infantry and armor was improvised rather than systematic, dependent on commanders' personal relationships and initiative rather than standardized procedures. The exploitation of the Remagen bridgehead demonstrated American coordination operating at strategic scale. Within days of the bridge's capture, 1st Army Commander General Courtney Hodges had committed 5 divisions to expand the bridgehead. Supreme Commander Eisenhower, recognizing the strategic opportunity, shifted the operational emphasis from Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's planned crossing in the north to exploitation at Remagen. Logistics networks were reconfigured to support the new axis of advance. Air support priorities were adjusted. Artillery assets were concentrated. The entire theater reoriented toward exploiting success at Remagen, and did so within a week. The speed of strategic reorientation was possible because American military organization was built for such flexibility. Unlike the German military, which was organized around relatively fixed operational plans, American forces were structured to adapt rapidly to changing circumstances. Logistics were organized in flexible networks rather than fixed pipelines. Command relationships could be adjusted through simple orders rather than requiring organizational restructuring. Support assets like artillery and engineers were organized in pools that could be attached to combat units as needed rather than being permanently assigned. This organizational flexibility was enabled by standardization at tactical levels. Because all American divisions followed similar organization and doctrine, they could be shifted between different commands without extensive reorientation. A division moving from 3rd Army to 1st Army control could begin operations immediately because both armies operated on similar principles, used the same procedures, expected the same standards of performance. The standardization that some critics derided as inflexibility actually enabled strategic flexibility by making tactical coordination reliable and predictable. The German response to Remagen demonstrated the opposite, an organization that had lost the ability to coordinate at strategic scale. Hitler ordered counterattacks but lacked forces to execute them effectively. Multiple headquarters issued conflicting orders to the same units. Reinforcements were dispatched piecemeal from different sectors without overall coordination. The V-2 rocket program was ordered to target the bridge, a desperation measure using strategic weapons for tactical purposes, but achieved nothing beyond demonstrating Germany's inability to respond effectively through conventional military means. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, appointed theater commander in the West just days before the Remagen crossing, later described his inability to coordinate an effective response. "I received reports of the American crossing hours after it occurred. I ordered counterattacks but discovered that units nominally under my command were also receiving orders from other headquarters. Communications with subordinate commands were sporadic. Intelligence about American strength in the bridgehead was fragmentary and often contradictory. I attempted to concentrate forces for a coordinated assault but found that units arrived at different times, that supporting artillery was unavailable or misdirected, that even basic coordination between adjacent formations was impossible to achieve reliably. The Americans expanded their bridgehead not because we lacked forces to stop them but because we could not coordinate the forces we had. Our military system, which had once enabled brilliant operational maneuvers, had collapsed under the weight of losses, disruption, and leadership failures. We had become incapable of the coordination necessary for effective defense. The logistics supporting American operations at Remagen embodied the coordination that enabled operational success. Within hours of the bridge's capture, engineer units were strengthening the structure, examining it for damage, preparing it to support heavy traffic. Pontoon bridges were constructed adjacent to the Ludendorff Bridge to provide additional crossing capacity. Tank transporters brought armored vehicles forward. Supply trucks began crossing immediately, delivering ammunition, fuel, and rations to units in the expanding bridgehead. Medical evacuation routes were established. Military police organized traffic control. Signal Corps units laid communications cables. All of this occurred simultaneously, coordinated through systems that made such complexity manageable. The American logistics system in Europe by 1945 was operating at scales unprecedented in military history. The Red Ball Express and similar truck convoy systems delivered thousands of tons of supplies daily from ports to forward units. Fuel pipelines, constructed by engineer units, pumped gasoline from coastal refineries to forward depots. Railway networks, rehabilitated as Allied forces advanced, moved bulk supplies. Air transport delivered critical items. The logistics infrastructure was so robust that American units rarely worried about supply shortages. They expected supplies to arrive, and when disruptions occurred, the system adapted rapidly to restore flow. German logistics, by contrast, had collapsed almost entirely. Fuel shortages limited movement. Ammunition was rationed. Food supplies were inadequate. Transportation networks were disrupted by Allied air interdiction. The coordination necessary to move supplies from production to combat units had broken down under the accumulated damage of years of attrition warfare. German units at Remagen, ordered to counterattack the American bridgehead, often lacked the fuel to move or the ammunition to sustain combat. The logistics disparity was not merely quantitative but systematic. American logistics were organized as a coordinated network where disruption in one route could be compensated by others. Supplies flowed forward through multiple channels: rail, truck, pipeline, air, providing redundancy that made the system resilient to disruption. German logistics, dependent on increasingly fragile rail networks and critically short of motor transport, lacked such redundancy. When routes were disrupted, alternatives often did not exist. An American logistics officer, Lieutenant Colonel John Sheehan, serving with 1st Army Supply Services during the Remagen operation, recorded in his operational diary the scale of coordination required. In the first week after capturing the bridge, we moved 5 divisions across the Rhine and sustained them in continuous combat. This required delivering approximately 5,000 tons of supplies daily to the bridgehead: ammunition, fuel, rations, medical supplies, spare parts, construction materials. We established supply routes, organized truck convoys, coordinated delivery schedules, managed traffic crossing the bridge, distributed supplies to forward units. The operation required coordinating hundreds of supply trucks, dozens of engineer units, multiple quartermaster companies, medical evacuation teams, and traffic control detachments. Every element functioned according to established procedures. Every unit knew its role. The entire system operated without drama or crisis because everyone did their job competently, following doctrine that made coordination systematic rather than improvised. The routine nature of what Sheehan described was itself extraordinary. The American military had systematized operations of such complexity that they were considered routine, had developed procedures and training that made massive logistics coordination manageable, had built an organizational culture where such achievements were expected rather than celebrated. This normalization of complexity was perhaps the ultimate expression of American coordination, not exceptional performance in crisis but consistent competence in conditions that would have overwhelmed less systematic organizations. The air-ground coordination that supported American operations at Remagen represented another dimension of systematic integration. Allied tactical aircraft provided close air support to ground forces, interdicted German reinforcements, maintained air superiority over the battle area, all coordinated through procedures that made air support a routine element of ground operations. Forward air controllers, positioned with ground units, communicated directly with aircraft overhead. Target priorities were established through coordination between air and ground commanders. Battle damage assessment was conducted systematically and used to refine targeting. German forces at Remagen faced air attacks that were not only overwhelming in volume but precisely coordinated with ground operations. American artillery would suppress German anti-aircraft guns, allowing aircraft to attack more safely. Aircraft would strike German positions immediately before American ground assaults, timing attacks to maximize effect without endangering friendly forces. The coordination was not perfect, friendly fire incidents occurred, timing was sometimes imprecise, but the system functioned reliably enough that American ground commanders routinely incorporated air support into their operational planning. The Luftwaffe, in contrast, had ceased to function as a coordinated force by 1945. German aircraft occasionally appeared over Remagen but in small numbers, without fighter escort, achieving minimal coordination with ground operations. The few German air attacks on the bridge were conducted by pilots operating with inadequate intelligence, insufficient coordination with ground forces attempting to defend against American air defenses, and no realistic prospect of success. The attacks were acts of desperation rather than elements of coordinated operational plans. A German Luftwaffe pilot, Lieutenant Hans Weber, who survived being shot down during an attack on the Remagen Bridge in mid-March 1945, described the hopelessness of the mission during post-war interviews. "We received orders to attack the bridge but minimal information about defenses, no escort fighters, inadequate ordnance for the mission. We flew individually rather than in coordinated formations because we lacked sufficient aircraft for proper formation flying. We arrived over the target to find American anti-aircraft fire of density I had never encountered. We had no coordination with ground forces who might have suppressed some defenses. We had no fighter escort to engage American interceptors. We attacked because we were ordered to, knowing the mission would fail, knowing most of us would not return. This was not warfare. This was sacrifice without purpose, individual courage expended without system to give it effect." Weber's experience exemplified the collapse of German military effectiveness in the war's final months, not because German soldiers lacked courage or skill, but because the systems that enabled coordination had disintegrated. Individual units might perform well, individual soldiers might fight bravely, but without coordination across units and branches, individual excellence could not achieve operational success against an enemy whose coordination multiplied individual competence into collective superiority. The transformation in German perception regarding American military effectiveness was documented in intelligence reports, prisoner interrogations, and post-war memoirs. Early in the war, German assessments of American forces had been dismissive, characterizing American soldiers as poorly trained, American tactics as unimaginative, American commanders as competent but not brilliant. These assessments were not entirely wrong. American forces in 1942 and early 1943 were indeed learning, making mistakes, developing the competence that would characterize later operations. But by 1945, German assessments had transformed. Intelligence reports described American forces as highly effective, emphasizing their coordination, their reliable logistics, their flexible command structures. The dismissive tone had been replaced by sober recognition that American forces possessed systematic advantages that German forces could not match. The psychological impact was significant. German soldiers who had been indoctrinated with propaganda about American weakness faced an enemy who coordinated operations more effectively than their own military, who possessed material abundance beyond imagination, who operated with confidence born of systemic superiority. A German intelligence summary from February 1945, captured by American forces and preserved in military archives, analyzed American operational methods. The enemy's strength lies not in superior tactics or brilliant command, but in superior coordination at all levels. Their operations are predictable because they follow established patterns, but this predictability does not create vulnerability because they execute these patterns with such reliability and force that anticipation does not enable effective countermeasures. They coordinate infantry, armor, artillery, engineers, and air support seamlessly. They maintain communications that enable responsive command. They deliver logistics that sustain operations. They possess organizational depth that allows them to absorb casualties and continue operations. Fighting them is like fighting a machine, predictable but unstoppable, systematic rather than brilliant, overwhelming through cumulative effect rather than operational surprise. The machine metaphor appeared repeatedly in German accounts. It captured the German perception of American military operations as systematic, reliable, impersonal, qualities that German military culture traditionally valued less than individual initiative and tactical artistry. But by 1945, facing systematic coordination backed by material abundance, German soldiers understood that the machine was defeating the artist, that reliable competence was overwhelming tactical brilliance, that coordination was proving more decisive than improvisation. This realization was psychologically devastating for soldiers who had been trained to believe in the superiority of German military skill. The Wehrmacht had built its identity around operational excellence, tactical innovation, the warrior tradition of Prussia. To acknowledge that these qualities were insufficient, that an enemy who emphasized procedures over brilliance and coordination over improvisation was winning decisively, this challenged fundamental assumptions about military effectiveness and national capability. The disillusionment was captured in letters and diaries from German soldiers in the war's final months. One letter, written by Feldwebel Anton Richter and intercepted by American intelligence in April 1945, expressed the psychological impact. We were taught that German soldiers were the finest in the world, that our training and our tactics were superior, that victory was inevitable because we possessed advantages the enemy could not match. But everything we were taught has been proven false. The Americans coordinate operations more effectively than we do. Their supplies arrive while ours do not. Their communications function while ours fail. Their system works while ours collapses. We have skill and courage, but these are not enough against an enemy who has built a military machine that functions regardless of individual brilliance or heroism. We are being defeated not because we lack courage, but because our enemy has systematized warfare in ways we never imagined necessary. The broader strategic context of American coordination extended beyond tactical and operational effectiveness to encompass industrial production, training systems, and strategic planning. American coordination was not merely military but societal, the integration of civilian and military sectors, of industrial production and military deployment, of scientific research and operational application. The Manhattan Project, simultaneously developing atomic weapons while conventional operations continued, exemplified this comprehensive coordination. The shipbuilding programs that produced hundreds of vessels, the aircraft production that delivered thousands of planes, the mobilization of millions of soldiers, all occurred simultaneously, coordinated through governmental and industrial systems that spanned a continent. German society, despite totalitarian control that theoretically enabled comprehensive mobilization, never achieved comparable coordination. Production remained fragmented across multiple authorities competing for resources. Military and civilian sectors operated with inadequate integration. Strategic planning was subject to Hitler's erratic decision-making, preventing systematic long-term coordination. The result was that Germany, despite impressive achievements in specific technological domains, could not match American systematic integration of society's total capabilities toward war aims. The victory at Remagen and subsequent operations demonstrated this systematic superiority in microcosm. American forces captured the bridge through tactical initiative, exploited it through operational flexibility, sustained operations through logistical coordination, and integrated the success into strategic plans, all coordinated across echelons from individual soldier to theater commander, all supported by systems that functioned reliably because they had been designed, tested, and refined through years of systematic development. For German observers, both military and civilian, Remagen became symbolic of American operational capability. The bridge became a metaphor in German discourse, representing not just a tactical defeat but a demonstration of coordination that Germany could not counter. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels, in his diary entry for March 9, 1945, acknowledged the disaster. The Americans have crossed the Rhine. Our forces failed to destroy the bridge at Remagen, and now enemy divisions pour across. This is catastrophic not merely for the immediate tactical situation but for what it demonstrates about American capability. They exploited this opportunity with speed we cannot match, with coordination we cannot achieve, with resources we cannot counter. The crossing at Remagen is not an isolated failure but a symptom of systematic inferiority that pervades our military situation. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen collapsed on March 17, 1945, 10 days after its capture, weakened by damage and the stress of continuous heavy traffic. By then, American engineers had constructed multiple pontoon bridges, and the original bridge's collapse merely inconvenienced rather than disrupted operations. The bridgehead had expanded to encompass over 200 square miles of territory on the Rhine's eastern bank. 7 American divisions had crossed. The barrier that was supposed to delay Allied advance for months had been breached in days. The subsequent Allied advance into Germany's heartland proceeded with the systematic coordination demonstrated at Remagen. Multiple Rhine crossings were executed, Montgomery's elaborate operation in the north, Patton's opportunistic crossing in the south, all coordinated as elements of comprehensive strategic plans. German resistance, though occasionally fierce, could not halt advances supported by coordination that integrated all arms, that delivered overwhelming material superiority to breakthrough points, that exploited success faster than German forces could organize coherent defense. The final collapse of German military resistance in April and May 1945 was not primarily caused by lack of courage or will among German soldiers but by the disintegration of coordination necessary for organized defense. Units became isolated, unable to communicate with higher headquarters or adjacent formations. Supplies ceased arriving. Orders arrived late or not at all. The systematic coordination that had once characterized German military operations, that had enabled the blitzkrieg victories of 1939 to 1941, had dissolved under years of attrition, leadership failures, and the overwhelming pressure of enemies who coordinated more effectively. American forces advancing into Germany in April 1945 encountered defenders who fought with desperation but without coordination, who possessed courage but lacked system, who demonstrated that individual heroism could not substitute for collective organization. The contrast was absolute. American units operated with confidence born of reliable coordination, advancing according to plans that assumed support would arrive, communications would function, supplies would flow. German units operated in isolation, improvising desperately, knowing they fought alone against an enemy whose coordination made every American unit stronger than the sum of its individual soldiers. The final weeks of the European War demonstrated warfare transformed by coordination. Battles were won not through tactical brilliance but through systematic application of coordinated force. Advances occurred because logistics sustained them, because communications enabled responsive command, because air support was available when needed, because engineers bridged obstacles, because medical services evacuated casualties, because every element of military operations functioned with sufficient reliability that commanders could plan complex operations with confidence in execution. Standing today on the site where the Ludendorff Bridge once spanned the Rhine, the towers remain, now housing a museum. One can visualize that March afternoon when American forces crossed into Germany's heartland. The placid river flows as it did then, indifferent to the history enacted on its banks. Tourist information plaques describe the bridge's capture, the strategic significance, the subsequent operations. The descriptions are accurate but necessarily simplified, focusing on dramatic events rather than systematic coordination that made those events possible. The deeper story of Remagen is not the bridge's capture, but what that capture revealed about military effectiveness in industrial warfare. American success was not achieved through superior courage. German defenders fought with determination. It was not achieved through tactical brilliance. The American assault was straightforward, even predictable. Success was achieved through coordination that functioned reliably across every level, that integrated all elements of military power, that operated with systematic efficiency that overwhelmed defenders who possessed skill and determination but lacked comparable systems. The hum of radio traffic, that symbolic sound of American coordination, has long since faded. The command posts are silent, the radio operators gone, the networks that carried information and orders across continents now replaced by technologies unimaginable in 1945. But the principle demonstrated at Remagen remains fundamental, that modern warfare is decided by systems more than soldiers, by coordination more than courage, by organizational effectiveness more than individual heroism. The lesson was learned at terrible cost. Hundreds of American soldiers died capturing and defending the Remagen bridgehead. Thousands of German soldiers died attempting to contain or eliminate it. The Rhine's waters, flowing past Remagen in March 1945, carried the reflection of tragedy, of young men dying in the final months of a war whose outcome was already determined, of sacrifice demanded by coordination failures on one side and coordination successes on the other. But the lesson endures beyond the immediate tragedy. It speaks to the nature of organized violence between industrial societies, to the advantages that accrue to nations capable of coordinating their entire capabilities toward strategic objectives, to the reality that wars are won by systems that enable millions of individuals to work toward common purpose with sufficient coordination that their individual contributions cumulate into collective power. The Americans who crossed at Remagen were not supermen. They were citizen soldiers, many drafted from civilian life, trained to competence rather than excellence. They were supported by systems, communications, logistics, doctrine, training, that enabled them to function effectively as coordinated forces. They operated within organizational structures that rewarded initiative while maintaining coherence, that allowed flexibility within framework of common procedures, that made complexity manageable through standardization and systematic planning. Their opponents were professional soldiers, heirs to military traditions centuries old, trained in tactics and operations that had once conquered continents. But they operated within a system that had lost the ability to coordinate, that could no longer deliver supplies reliably, that lacked communications to enable responsive command, that possessed skill but not system sufficient to counter enemies whose coordination multiplied individual competence into collective superiority. The bridge at Remagen has not been rebuilt. The towers stand as monuments, the river flows between them, the gap representing both physical absence and historical transformation. The bridge's brief existence as an intact crossing point changed the course of military operations, shortened the war, demonstrated principles of military effectiveness that remain relevant across decades of technological and doctrinal evolution. What crossed at Remagen was not merely an army but a demonstration of coordinated power, systematic, reliable, responsive to opportunity, capable of exploiting success at every level from individual initiative to strategic reorientation. The sound of vehicles crossing the bridge, that mechanical rumble Karl Scheller heard with disbelief and despair, was the sound of coordination transformed into unstoppable advance, of systems functioning with cumulative effect that no amount of individual excellence could counter. In the silence that now hangs over Remagen, where tourist boats carry visitors and cyclists cross on modern bridges, the lesson persists, that military effectiveness in modern warfare flows from coordination more than courage, from systems more than soldiers, from organization that enables millions to work effectively together toward common purpose. The Americans who crossed at Remagen understood this imperfectly, if at all. They simply did their jobs, followed their training, executed their missions. But collectively, systematically, they demonstrated a truth about warfare that their enemies learned too late, that perfect coordination, enabled by technology and doctrine and training and logistics, creates military power that individual brilliance cannot overcome and heroism cannot defeat. The Rhine flows on, carrying water and history, reflecting sky and memory. The bridge is gone, but what it represented, the triumph of coordination over improvisation, of system over skill, of organized collective power over individual excellence, remains carved into history, demonstrated at cost, proven through sacrifice, enduring as testament to what industrial societies can achieve when they coordinate their capabilities comprehensively toward strategic purpose. The machine defeated the artist. The system overcame the individual. Coordination proved unstoppable. And in that really